I'm covering chapters 8 to 10 in Hebrews because it's all really centered around one point. And the author is just being really, really redundant with this one point. Literally, for 3 chapters, Hebrews 8, 9, and 10, he's really just kind of putting different angles to drive home the same point. And so that's why I wanted to tackle 3 chapters today. I was really going back and forth and breaking it down into 3 different weeks and whatever, but I just thought it's one big point. He's going over and over and being redundant, and so we're going to tackle all 3 chapters today to drive home a single point. And the single point that he's making in all 3 of these chapters really has to do with this biblical idea of covenant. It's covenant. When I say covenant, I want you to repeat after me. Covenant. Covenant is probably something you've heard me say a lot. I call you all the time covenant members. I talk about God's relationship with us being a covenant relationship. Whenever I use the analogy of marriage, I'm talking about the covenantal marriage or the covenantal relationship of marriage. You've heard the word covenant a lot. In fact, there's a whole theology that's called covenant theology. But if you don't know what covenant actually means and you're just kind of hoping that one day you'll get it, the more and more I talk about it, it's okay, because I want you, if any, today to grasp onto this idea what covenant is and start to apply it in your system of thinking. Hebrews 8, 9, and 10 is all about covenant. Now let me explain it this way. Covenant can be defined as a formal relationship. Now that's a little tricky, right? Relationship, you obviously understand. When I say relationship, I want you to repeat after me. Relationship. You obviously understand what a relationship is, but as soon as I tackle on the word formal, then it becomes something else. A formal relationship, that just sounds weird. That just sounds binding. It just sounds like there's all these rules and regulations that I have to follow. I like the kind of relationships where it's just free-flowing, it's natural, whatever comes, comes. But when I say a formal relationship, I'm not talking about acquaintances, okay? I'm not saying you saying what's up to your mailman, once every other week or something like that. I'm not talking about people you barely know or you're in the process of getting to know. I'm talking about, when I say formal relationships, I'm talking about people that you really, really care about. I'm talking about the relationships that are really important to you. Boyfriends and girlfriends. Husbands and wives. And I would even say close friends or best friends. Because what happens when you have some kind of close relationship, you're in a relationship that you really deeply care about, what happens when something doesn't happen the way you like? You get hurt, you get angry. Why does that happen? Because you have expectations. As soon as you put an expectation on a relationship, you now have a covenantal relationship. As soon as you can say, well, I'm hurt by this relationship, I'm delighted by this relationship is important to me. As soon as you say, I have any kind of expectation on this relationship, you have now created a covenantal relationship. So that's what I mean when I say a covenant is a formal relationship. Now, if I take that a step further, it's not just a formal relationship, but I would also say it's a legal way of holding to a promise. Right? So try that on for size, okay? It's a legal way of holding on to a promise. And so this is where we need to distinguish a covenant from a contract. A contract says, you hold up your end of the bargain, and so will I. But if you break your end of the bargain, then I'm free from that kind of contractual relationship, and I don't have to follow through with it. But a covenant says, even if you fail, even if you don't hold up your end of the bargain, I will. Church, does that remind you of something? Well, that's the gospel, right? That is the gospel. You experience covenantal relationship with God as a Christian every moment and every day in your life. Every time you say, I have failed. Every time you spiritually commit adultery against God. Every time you sin through action or through deed, you commit the spiritual adultery against God and you break that covenant, and God says, I'm still holding on to you. So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing that we're talking about when I say covenant. So Hebrews 8 to 10 is all about this covenant. And so I want you to hear me when I say this. If you care about your relationship with God, if your relationship with God is important to you, you need to care, excuse me, about the new covenant that you live as a Christian. That's what this is all about. You can't really say that you believe in the gospel and not understand the new covenant that we have through Jesus Christ. So here's the outline. Here's just a quick flow or an outline for you to follow through. It's all about covenant. First, we're going to talk about the problem of the old covenant. Second, the result of the new covenant. And third, the call of the new covenant. So the problem of the old covenant. Now go to chapter 9. We're going to jump around just a little bit just so that we can kind of make sense and have some structure to our talk today. Go to chapter 9. Now, if you want to quickly look at verses 1 to 7, I'm not going to read everything verse by verse. Just quickly identify chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. This is going to be a summary of how the tabernacle is set up. Okay? The tabernacle, right, he says it's the tent. It's the movable, transportational kind of tent that they used to set up the temporary sacrificial system. It was their portable tent, if you will. So before the temple was built, they had the tabernacle and they would move around. They would literally set it up, break it down, and move to the next location. And that's where they had their sacrifices. Now go to verse 8, chapter 9, verse 8. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. Now, pay attention to this. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. So the author brings up this very interesting word here, conscience. The tabernacle stuff, the ceremonial stuff, he's saying it can't perfect our conscience. Church, what does that mean? I don't know. Let's keep reading. Verse 11. But when Christ, three of the most beautiful words in the Bible, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Here's what we need to think about. What does the author mean by conscience? And he uses it it seems like a lot of different contexts. Perfect the conscience, right? In verse 14, he says, purify our conscience from dead works. Here's what I want you to think about, especially as Easter approaches. I want you to think about this, and I want all of our covenant members, there it is again, I want all of our covenant members to be very keen on what happens every Easter. I want you to imagine, okay, what it's like for someone who has never been to church to step into a church for the first time. So let's just start with our building. When you look outside, you see the sign. It says Trinity CRC, Sengmyeong Samgyo, which is the church of the Korean name of our church, right? As soon as you see those signs, that's a powerful, powerful thing happening. Do you know why? It's not powerful to you because some of us, we're at church 2-3 times a week, and this is a place where we come. It's like home. It's community. We don't think about the sign. We just come and do what we need to do. But from someone who doesn't go to church, for someone who doesn't even step into the church at all, that's a powerful, powerful thing. Because when you invite them to Easter, and you're persistent with them, and you're saying, hey, it's going to be good, there's going to be food, there's going to be celebration, right? And they're going to nod their head, and they're going to say, maybe, 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 and then Easter comes, and then they don't come, and you're like, what's wrong with you? Just come. How many times do I have to ask you? What is it that they're really saying? As soon as they see those signs, as soon as they park, as soon as they come into here, do you know how much courage it takes for someone who is not a Christian, for someone who doesn't step into the church, to step into a church? Because one of the unspoken things that they say is because if I go to this church, not only do I have to step into a new social setting, not only do I have to sing a bunch of songs that I never heard of, everyone's clapping, everyone's looking at the screen, like what is happening? You know, who is this guy yelling at me and telling me how much of a sinner I am, right? And you call this a celebration, right? And then at the end of the day, what are they really, really thinking? Am I going to leave this church feeling judged? Am I going to go to this church, do the whole church experience thing on this Easter day, and am I going to feel more guilty than when I first came in? And you know, that's not even just a non-Christian thing, that's a Christian thing too. There's so many Christians who kind of sort of go to church, who will do the church thing, but they'll never really engage with community. They won't really engage with the living God because of this thing called guilt. That is what the author is talking about. When he says perfect the conscience, he's talking about something in you, something something that God has innately instilled in you, where you can measurably say there is something right and there is something wrong, and I'm in the wrong and I don't know how to fix it. You see, this is the power of guilt. There is someone on the East Coast who works with mental health patients. I believe he's a therapist. And he works with all kinds of mental health patients. And when I say mental health patients, I'm not talking about people who just need someone to talk to, people who have a bad day. I'm talking about people who are suicidal, people who have already tried to commit suicide. We're talking about extreme depression, high levels of anxiety. We're talking about people who really, really need help. And so this guy has a heart, this guy has a passion to help help these kinds of people. And this is what this professional said. He said, half of my patients would be home in a week if they knew they were forgiven. Half of my patients would be home in a week if they knew they were forgiven. Now, if you're not familiar how therapy works, therapy, whether it's Christian or non-Christian therapy, it goes for weeks, it goes for months, and possibly even years. And this guy is saying, if my patient just grasped the depth and the riches of God's mercy, I can send them home and they can fight their own battles. You see, when I heard this quote, it took me for a ride, no joke. It really took me for a ride because I heard it, and at first I was like, dude, that's truth right there. God's mercy. And then I started thinking about it some more, and I was like, I don't know, that sounds like an exaggeration to me. A week? Okay, maybe 2 weeks, I don't know, right? I started thinking about it some more, and then I thought about it even some more, and then I thought, maybe he's actually right. I started actually thinking about how powerful guilt actually is. Let me tell you why. I'm not a psychologist, obviously, but during my time as a pastor, and even before I was a pastor, I've had so many guys come up to me and confess their sins, particularly in the area of sexual purity. And when I say sexual purity, I mean, it's something that every guy struggles with. We could just throw it out there, right? Pornography and masturbation. Yeah, these things just fill us with guilt. It's hard to share. It's hard to process. It's hard to talk about publicly. But I'm not even talking about these things. I'm talking about even a little more hardcore things. One guy told me that he molested his sister. You see, when someone tells you that, what do you say? How do you counsel someone who shares that with you? And before he shared that with anyone, it took him years and seasons to finally come to a place where he said, I can't handle the guilt, and I need to tell someone. And this guy was in tears and snots, and I've never seen this guy cry. Another guy told me he was so heavily into porn that he started questioning his own sexuality. He's seen so many images of inappropriate things that he started confessing to me, I don't know if I'm gay. I'm thinking about all these images, and it's affecting me so much. I'm struggling with the fact that I don't know if I'm homosexual or not. And he's like, tell me, I wish I just knew. That way I know what to do with from there. Excuse me. But he was like, I don't know. And what do you say to that? Another guy told me he was basically offered sex at a shady massage parlor. He was struggling with porn and lust at the time. I'm not about to cry, I'm just coughing. And he went to get a massage, and they offered him sexual services, and he says, no, I don't want it. And they kept pushing it. Right? And I don't want to get graphic with it, but they kept pushing it, and at the end of the day, he basically kind of had to run out of there. But he felt so guilty because of all these mixed emotions happening, and he realized that he was a victim of almost rape. And you would think, well, what does rape have to do with men? It happens. And he was so ridden with guilt that it took him seasons and seasons and seasons just to be able to share that with someone. Back when I was in college, my friend tells me that he slept with one of his coworkers. He doesn't have feelings for this girl, it just happened. And he said he felt so guilty that he didn't know what to do. I felt like all I could really do is to be there for him and just listen to him and try to encourage him. And then he says, man, I really appreciate you being there for me. You know, can you not tell anyone? I was like, yeah, I'm not going to tell anyone. And then a week later, he comes up to me, you know, a little anxious, and he goes, hey, did you tell anyone? I said, no, I didn't tell anyone. He said, are you sure? I was like, yeah, I promise I didn't tell anyone. And now, because of his guilt, he just thinks that everyone knows about his situation, and he doesn't believe me. Even to this day, he doesn't believe me. He thinks that I'm lying to him when I say that I told people. Because the guilt just causes him to be so paranoid about being judged in the church that he can't handle it. Like when I say, like, guys have come to me, these are just a few cases. And I've heard so much more, and it's not like these guys are denying God. It's not like these guys are rebelling against God. These guys are Christian guys. These guys, some of them are now leaders in the church, right? It's not like they're running away from God in the church. They're plugged into small group. They're members at their church. They're serving. These guys are Christian guys. They love Jesus. And even if something like that happens, the guilt changes their relationships. It affects their relationship with God. It affects their relationship at home. It affects their work life. It affects their mental health. It affects their spiritual life. It is such a powerful thing, guilt. And my point today isn't about sexual purity, but I already know that there's probably a lot of sexual sin in this room. And I know it's hard to talk about. We don't like to share about it. But I'm just going to figure there's a lot of sexual sin in this room that we struggle with. But that's not even my point today, but I'm just using that example to just really, honestly, I just want to say that that the power that guilt has is far greater than we think. And as soon as we think that we have a handle on our guilt, I think in a lot of ways we already lost. We think that we can just temporarily put on something as we go to church, kind of temporarily shelter us from the guilt, and we go home. But the truth is, a lot of times we go to church trying to fix our guilt, when in reality we leave with even heavier guilt on our shoulders. I can honestly say that a lot of these guys that I've talked to, or all these guys that I've talked to, I can share about them because they've experienced victory, they've experienced recovery, they've experienced grace and mercy in their own lives. These guys are transformed men. But the point I want to point you to is this. Now imagine living in a system, or now living in a covenant, where there is no real forgiveness. Living in a religious system, your spiritual life, your religious life, everything that you believe about God, everything that you believe about salvation, it is not about real forgiveness. You go to make your sacrifice desperately hoping that God would forgive you. You're desperately hoping that God would give you the opportunity for your sins to be atoned for. You want to be released from your guilt, but at the end of the day, you're not. Why? You see, here's the problem with the old covenant. I had a lot of time to think about this past week because I was sick. But the old covenant is like medicine, okay? And what I mean by that is, when I say medicine, I'm talking about like cough syrup, Robitussin, okay, Sudafed. I'm not talking about like chemotherapy or something hardcore like that, okay? Just simple medicine when you're sick. What does medicine do? What does medicine do? Right? All you like nurses and stuff are getting all excited. Calm down. Medicine just covers up your symptoms. It temporarily relieves whatever it is that you have. And so you're coughing and you take cough syrup, it just masks down the pain and numbs down the sensation so that you cough less, so that you can rest, right? And so does medicine actually cure you? Some of y'all, I don't think you understand this because you think that it does. I hate to burst your bubble. Medicine doesn't actually cure you. Medicine just dumbs down your pain so that your body is the one that actually needs to change and transform. Did you know that? So if the old covenant is like medicine, what is it? What am I really trying to say? The old covenant is like sticking a Band-Aid on the heavy conscience and the guilt that you have of your soul, hoping that it'll cure, hoping that it'll transform, hoping that it'll be fixed. But what's going to happen? Eventually, that Band-Aid is going to come off. Eventually, that cough syrup is going to wear off. Eventually, that temporary aid is not going to be permanent, as you will realize one day. That is the problem of the old covenant. It is a spiritual Band-Aid that you're putting on yourself, and it does nothing but cover up and dumb down the pain. So think about that, church. Do you want to live your life with a massive Band-Aid to cover your guilt? What happens when you put on a spiritual Band-Aid? You put on a temporary sense of forgiveness, and then what happens? You do life, you do relationships, you do job, school, and everything else, and you think that everyone else seems to be forgiven and freed from their sin except for you. Right? That's church culture. I think every church will struggle with that kind of church culture. You show up and you put on because everyone else seems to get it. Everyone else seems to be plugged into small group, and they seem to get, what's going on. They seem to get grace. They seem to get this covenantal language of God's love, but you don't. And so you don't want to be the one to be judged. You don't want to be the one to not get it. And so what do? You start putting up a false righteousness. Right? If you've been doing the corporate devotionals, then you came across this passage in Matthew about the fig tree. Weird passage. Jesus literally goes to a fig tree, looks at it, curses it, and then it goes, Right? That's what I see in my head. I've never seen a fig tree. Right? The closest I come to a fig tree is a fig Newton. Okay? So this fig tree is up there, right? He's doing his thing. Hey, what's up, Jesus? I'm a fig tree. Curse you. And then it just literally dies. Right? He's condemning it. And you're doing your QT and you're journaling. I guess Jesus hates fig trees, right? That's my application. I should hate fig trees too. Obviously not. What's the idea here? Fig trees were in season. Jesus saw the fig tree from afar. It looked good. He's down for a healthy snack. He's down for a free snack. He comes to the tree and there's no sign of life. It's just death. Why does he curse the tree? Because he's thinking about his people. He's not thinking about some stupid figs. He's thinking about his people. From afar, they look righteous, don't they? From afar, they put on that spiritual Band-Aid and they look righteous, they look good. You take a look up close, no life, false righteousness, deadness. Jesus isn't concerned about figs, but he is very, very concerned about his people putting on false righteousness with no real internal change. Pastor Paul Tripp has a really good analogy on this. He says it's like stapling apples to an apple tree. It's like taking apples that are already dead and trying to staple it onto a tree, trying to put on the appearance of righteousness and fruitfulness in your life. God doesn't want his people stapling on fake fruit. God doesn't want his people putting on behavior modification. That's not why he sent his son to die. God desires transformation, and he desires a change of your will. So the problem of the old covenant is that it only gives a temporary sense of forgiveness. But now there's the result of the new covenant. This entire passage, literally chapters 8 to 10, is based on this idea of tabernacle worship. And like I said, it's this portable tent that would move around, and they would set up an entire worshiping system for it. Now I'm going to work backwards a little bit, but I want you to go to chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8. Here's what's happening in verses 1 to 7. There's an entire system of worship happening. And right, it's the language of tabernacle. And it's the word tent, right, that keeps coming up. And it was literally a movable tent, like I said. Now remember when we went through Leviticus 16 a few weeks ago, we talked about the Day of Atonement. We talked about the high priest once a year. That would be where he did the sacrifice. It would be in the tabernacle. Now, this is the point that the author is making from this whole language of tabernacle. That entire system of worship is just a copy. It's a shadow. It's not the true kind of worship that God desires. Right? And so that's the flaw of the old covenantal system. Now, when you look at verses 8 to 13, you're going to see that it's indented, and it's because it's quoted from Jeremiah 31. So here's what I'm asking you to do, church. Turn to Jeremiah 31. Okay? Some of y'all are like really, really scared because you don't even know Jeremiah was a book of the Bible. It's in the Old Testament. I'll give you some time to look at it. If you're using your phones, just cheat, look at the table of contents. It's fine. I want you to turn to Jeremiah 31. This is what the author is quoting in Hebrews chapter 8. Jeremiah 31:31. I'm not reading Hebrews 8, I'm reading Jeremiah. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people, and no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, I know the Lord, for they shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. So the author is pulling from the prophecy in Jeremiah. Church, this is so awesome. I know you're just kind of reading that for the first time, but this is so awesome, because what's happening is Jeremiah is quoting God. By the way, when you see in your Bibles, declares the Lord, or thus saith the Lord, that's when you kind of need to perk up your soul and pay attention, because it's God who is speaking. And God himself is saying that I will put my law within them. Think about that. How can God put a law on your heart? What does that even mean? This is the new covenant that we're talking about now. It's not the old covenant anymore. It's not about putting a spiritual band-aid on. It's not a temporary sacrificial system. This is now a permanent inner working of the law that God instills on your heart. God says, I will write it on their hearts. In other words, the covenant is no longer a band-aid for your soul. In other words, God's saying, I want a real, authentic, loving relationship with my people. I don't want temporary. I don't want external. I don't want you stapling on apples appearing to be fruitful and holy. I want something real. This is what God is saying when he says, I'm going to write it on their hearts. And the reason I want you to see the original quote is because there's something that the author leaves out in Hebrews. Honestly, I don't know why. When I'm looking at Hebrews 8, and I actually took the time to go back to Jeremiah 31, there's something in there that's missing. I don't think it's error. I don't think it's because he just forgot. I just think it's because it's language that the Jews just knew so well, he felt like he didn't have to put it in. There's this one little verse in verse 32, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day that when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband. Little clause that God sticks in there, but it's so, so awesome. What is the result of the new covenant, church? God has married to his people. An eternal covenant that's not defined by some temporary sacrifice. So imagine this. You meet someone and you think they're kind of cute, they're kind of special, they're kind of nice, and you develop this crush on them, and you find out that person likes you back, and so you start making moves, you go on a few dates, you start seeing each other, you start talking about in your small group, is this person right? I don't know, right? And then all of a sudden you say, hey, we're going to have a DTR, and then you hash things out, all right? And now you're like, okay, let's make it official. When does your relationship become official? Can we be real? When does your relationship become official? I know you're thinking no one wants to say Facebook status, right? Isn't that like the most official thing? You know what I'm saying? I can announce it up here on a Sunday service, but it's not official until you see it in the Facebook status, right? So your Facebook status has now changed. Now it's official. Super duper official, right? And so then what happens? What happens over time? Let's just say, for example, it's official on Facebook, but now you text them less. You don't spend as much time with them. You don't talk to them on the phone. You're not really pursuing that person. You don't really make sacrifices for them. You hang out with your friends way more than you do that person. And it's just a matter of time before this person is basically non-existent in your life, even though your Facebook status still says that you are dating this person in a relationship with. You are in a loveless relationship. It doesn't matter what some Facebook status says. It doesn't matter what some document says. It doesn't matter. What's the point that God is making here when he calls himself the husband? If you keep saying, I love you, I love you, I love you, God, but you don't show it, you're simply living off of a Facebook status relationship with God. There is no real affection. There's no real pursuit. There's no real sacrifice. There's no real, I love you, and I'm going to follow through with it. And when you do that, you are willingly going back to the old covenantal system and saying, I'm happy putting on a spiritual Band-Aid and being temporarily forgiven of my guilt. You see, the result of the new covenant is that God is holding on to you. And he's saying it's not just a Facebook status, it's not just some written document thing, but I've written it on your heart. It is sealed with a purpose, and I'm holding on to it even when you don't. So here's the call of the new covenant. Go back to Hebrews chapter 10. This is the last time we're going to flip through today. I'm going to close out our time by looking at this passage. We're going to see three exhortations. I'm not going to cover the whole chapter. Hebrews chapter 10. Go to verse 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God. Now, I'm going to stop there. This is what I mean by redundant, okay? He literally just said this in 3 chapters, and he's saying it again. But now, pay attention to what he says here, verse 22. Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Verse 24, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day drawing near. When I think about the redundant and repeated point that the author has been making in chapters 8 to 10, when I think about the message of the new covenant, I'm studying on this, and I'm chewing on this, and I'm just kind of regurgitating over it in my head, this is what I've boiled it down to. If we have a new covenant relationship with God, then we must have a new covenant relationship with each other. Think on that. If we have a new covenantal relationship with God, then amongst Christians, we have a new covenantal relationship with each other. And if we have a new covenantal relationship with each other, then we have to stop acting like we have this Facebook status of church and actually start pursuing each other in community. You can't call yourself a member here and just assume that you're a functional member. You feel me, church? That's Facebook status membership. Some of you think that a piece of paper is what makes you a member. But what makes you a member at Livestream, and I want you to listen to this, what makes you a member at Livestream or any other church for that matter is when you root yourself in the community under the submission of the leadership and you start doing life together. You can sign your name on a document and you could take full advantage of the fact that the pastor's not really going to kick you out, and you can kind of sort of be in a relationship but not be in a covenant at all. It's when you root yourself and actually start pursuing life together in community. Because I say that because what do all these exhortations have in common? Let us, and let us. In other words, it's a corporate exhortation. You can't do this exhortation unless you are rooted in the relationships of church. Right? That's the call, church. That's the call of the new covenant. I was at KCM this week in Riverside, and I was preaching, and I was kind of going ham, and that's why I kind of lost my voice. But I kept saying church in my message, and I'm well aware of the fact that KCM is not a church. It's like the first thing they say. We are not, it's like fear in their eyes. We are not a church. Okay, let's go off fellowship. You know what I'm saying? Every time I go to any kind of campus ministry, we are not a church. And I kept saying church in my message. And what I meant to say was Christians, right? What I meant to say was Christians, saints, people who are saved. And so Timothy, the president of UCR KCM, as soon as the message was over, he comes to me and goes, "Hey, we're not a church." I was like, "Oh, okay, sorry," right? And so he made me go up and kind of correct myself and clarify what I meant by church, right? And so I'm thinking, okay, maybe I shouldn't have said that. I should have been more careful with my language. And even that whole night and the day after, I'm thinking, church, why do I keep saying church? And I kept thinking about what is KCM then? What is church and what is a parachurch? And my mind is kind of rolling over that. I'm even thinking about this. And I kept asking myself, what is the real importance of a church? What is the real importance of a church? Because I think one of the just reoccurring questions that young millennial Christians have is, why do I have to be a member of a church? Why can't I just be a Christian, right, and be part of the universal church instead of having to be plugged into a local church? Or why can't I just be saved and just hop around different churches and just be free and just kind of do what I want? Isn't that what God died for, my own freedom? And I thought, instead of trying to get all philosophical, instead of trying to be in it like a Tim Keller, I just thought biblically, what we see in the New Testament is that the New Testament is specifically written to who? The church. Did you know that? Did you know that the New Testament, primarily, it's not written to non-Christians? It's not evangelistic by nature? They're written to actual churches, not the universal church. Hardcore, tangible churches. The churches in Galatia. The churches in Ephesus. The church in Corinth. These are real historical cities with a collection of churches. These are actual, tangible letters, content inspired by God, written to actual churches, which are filled with Christians. And did you know you can't find a Christian in the New Testament who doesn't belong to a local body? There's no such thing as a free-floating Christian in the New Testament. And so let me give you an example of what I mean. You look at 1 Corinthians 13, it's the famous passage, love is patient, love is kind. Say amen if you're familiar with that passage. Love is patient, love is kind. As soon as that passage is over and it goes to 1 Corinthians 14, you know what it says? Pursue love. So if you take that completely out of context, right, you're not going to be wrong. Of course we should pursue love. Pursue love to the non-Christian. Pursue love in your workplace. Pursue love in anywhere. But specifically, what does it mean? In the community of the church, you pursue love. So what does that mean? If you are not actively pursuing life rooted with your members at church, you can't obey that command. How can you possibly pursue love if you are not around people? When you look at let us, that's a corporate exhortation. You can't do that apart from the church. You literally cannot apply this in the most simplistic way until you are rooted in the livelihood of the church and you are pursuing Jesus together. In all its jacked upness, in all its brokenness, in all its hypocrisy, you are staying in the fight and saying, let us. That is what the new covenant calls us to. That if in the new covenant God says, I have you, I have written my law on your heart, and nothing can take that away, that applies not just vertically but horizontally. We hold on to each other as an expression, as a result of the new covenant through the death and sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Amen? The problem of the old covenant is that it is a spiritual band-aid that temporarily relieves our guilt, but you will find out soon enough that guilt is a powerful thing. And unless it is eternally and permanently atoned for, you will live your life ridden with guilt. But there is a new covenant, and the result of the new covenant is that we are married to God permanently, that God has written his law on our hearts. And the call to that is to pursue church and to have purpose in the way that we do church. If you believe in that, say amen. Pray with me.